Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this morning on meeting your employer obligations. My name is Amanda Horan, and I'm a member of the Enterprise Development Team here at Fáilte, Ireland. So our focus really for today in this webinar is designed to help you and your business navigate the many employment recent legislation changes and the adoption of various new codes of practice since 2020 to ensure our industry, like all other industries, becomes recognised as better employers. Many of these changes really reflect recent employment legislation directives and Irish legislation amendments on foot of that. Some of these, as we know, were delayed in their enactment in Ireland due to COVID, which may explain why some businesses may be feeling a little overwhelmed now by the number of changes affecting contracts, payment of wages, leave arrangements, as well as all matters in regard to dignity and respect. And while we appreciate these changes are not only adding to the cost of your labour, but equally the administrative burden on businesses, it must be said that they are really designed to ensure greater transparency in employment terms and conditions and are more reflective of the current needs and attitudes of workers around juggling work-life balance and the need for employment stability, as well as issues regarding dignity, respect, diversity, equality, inclusion, and the protection and management of risks associated with bullying and harassment, including sexual harassment. So all in all, I think it's fair to say the changes will really help ensure our industry remains competitive with other industry sectors and that we are compliant with the rest of Europe. In fact, these changes, as adapted into your employment contracts, staff policies and training, will really support you to enhance and develop your employer brand reputation. So that means ensuring we understand, we know how to interpret, we correctly apply this into our communications, our staff training, our onboarding, our contracts, and we manage our records appropriately to ensure compliance of these changes and transparency around that. But really, I suppose the key for me in all of this is I think how it can really benefit our employer brand reputation and ensure that not only our efforts are attracting, but also retaining the best talent for our business and our sector. So without further ado, and to help us look at this, I'm going to now introduce you to our two experts that are joining us today to help us in our understanding and ensure we're correctly applying these changes, as well as providing the right communications and training and accurate records around it. So I'm delighted to welcome back two distinguished experts in their field of HR and people management consultancy, both Caroline Reedy and Dominique O'Sullivan. Both professionals, can I just say, have been instrumental in helping us to put together our supporting range of easy step-by-step video resource guides for you to engage with us as and when you need it for reference around these areas of meeting your employment obligations, and which my colleague Orna will step us through later before we finish this morning. So firstly, allow me to introduce you to Caroline from the HR suite and then Dominica from Action HR. Caroline Reedy, for those of you who don't know, is Managing Director of the HR Suite and an HR and employment law expert. She's a former member of the Low Pay Commission and she's also an adjudicator with the Workplace Relations Commission. As a trainer, presenter, keynote speaker and expert investigator, she holds a master's degree in human resource management and is accredited from the Chartered Institute of Professional Development, as well as being a trained mediator. She's also the author of a really successful book called The Art of Asking the Right Questions, which I personally can attest to being an invaluable toolkit for managers to ensure they maximise the talent of their people, and it contains really great tips and guidelines for anyone who manages people, be it through recruitment, appraisals, personal development and more. Caroline, thanks for being with us today. Our second expert is Dominica O'Sullivan, and Dominica comes to us as CIPD qualified HR consultant who delivers cutting-edge HR solutions with Action HR services that really gives her clients confidence in managing and growing their business. Dominica commenced her hospitality career with Hilton's Worldwide, where she held a range of HR positions, including HR manager for the Conrad Dublin and recruitment specialist for Hilton's Worldwide for Ireland-based properties. She has also worked as HR manager for Joyce Hotels and with the Delata Group, and she led the recruitment function and was co-lead in the HR function of preparing for the reopening of Adair Manor Resort in County Limerick. Her consulting career began in 2018 with the HR Suite, and having previously worked with Action HR, she was delighted to return there as HR Consulting Manager, leading Action's HR division, Welcome, Dominica, and it's great to have you with us. So without further ado, I'm actually going to get started because we have a lot to cover today, and I'm going to hand over to Caroline to begin with, to maybe take us through an overview of the summary key legislation changes in 2022 that's affecting businesses now for 2023. Over to you, Caroline.
Great, thanks Amanda, and good morning everybody. Delighted so many of you could make the live session, and it's great you've got the recording as well afterwards to go back on. So I'm going to start and take you through some of the key recent legislative changes that have been introduced. I'm going to start with the new minimum wage. So that has come in from the 1st of January 2023, and it has increased from £10.50 to £11.30. So really important we reflect that since then, and also just to be aware that the PRSI has also changed to ensure that there's no negative impact for employers or for employees since that has been introduced. So next, I'm going to update you on a very significant piece of legislation. So as you're aware, most of our legislation in Ireland comes from Europe. So the European directives we transpose into Irish legislation. And this piece of legislation was due to be transposed in August of 2022, but it was delayed to come into law on the 16th of December 2022. So it's very significant because it impacts three primary pieces of legislation. In particular, it impacts our terms of employment, it impacts our fixed term and our organisational working time. So as a result of that, it has a very important significance and some key elements of that. So it requires that now we need to give a 5-day statement to employees who start with the company. And this statement includes additional information, which I'll go through with you shortly. It also requires that we provide the contract of employment within the employee's first month of starting, rather than 2 months as it had initially been. And we also need to require more detail in that statement. I'm going to take you through both the statement and the contract at the outset, before the presentation finishes today. But our advice always is, from the outset, you really should give the full document to the employee, because it saves you an additional administrative task to give 2 documents otherwise. Also, probation, very significantly, is now a maximum of 6 months. And when you're giving a fixed term contract, the first contract can only contain probation. The only time it can be more than that is if it's in the best interest of the employee for a specific job, and they need to be explained that at the outset of their employment. So that's quite a very restricted amount of roles and jobs that you can have more than 6 months. So it needs to be an exception. So for all hospitality main employments now, the maximum probation is 6 months. It's also important to note that any employee who has been continuously with the employer for more than 6 months may request a more predictable and secure working condition contract. So again, if somebody has been employed on more ad hoc flexible working, after 6 months they can apply for more normal regulated hours if that is in place. It's also important to note that if the employer provides training, this training now needs to be provided to the employee free of charge, particularly if it's linked to a contractual obligation, or it's something linked to mandatory training, or it's linked to a collective agreement. It's also important to note that an employer can't stop an employee from taking up additional employment unless there's a specific prohibitive reason why you can't get them to do that double employment. So really, unless it meets one of the grounds that's outlined in the legislation, now you need to facilitate the employee to have more than one employment outside of your business, unless, for example, one of the restrictions is it's in direct competition with your business and there may be a breach of intellectual property. And there's also additional provisions for any employee who's posted to work abroad. So I'm next going to take you through the detail that's required in the specific changes to the statement first, and then I'm going to take you through the contract. So the 5-day statement will still continue to apply, and you need to outline the full name and address of the employer and the employee. And it's important that that's the registered name of the company as well as any trading name. You need to include the address of the employer, the expected duration of the contract, if it's fixed term or temporary, you need to outline the details linked to that. The rate or method of calculating pay and the pay reference period, and also what the employer reasonably expects the normal hours of the employee to be. So again, a specific reference in relation to that. So additionally now, this 5-day statement must also include details of the probation, what duration it's expected to be, and any specific terms linked to that. They must also outline the place of work, or if there's no fixed place of work, the various locations the employee is expected to work. Also, the title, grade, nature, and category of work, or a brief job description, the date of commencement of the contract, and any terms and conditions linked to working hours, including overtime. So as you can see, there's a lot more detail required in that initial 5-day statement that needs to be given to employees at that stage. So now I'm going to take you through the details that now are required to be given to an employee within the first month of their employment. So in the first month, remember this was 2 months initially, and now it's the first month. And you must outline the pay intervals, so when they get paid, details of any paid leave, including annual leave and public holidays, details of any sick pay entitlement, bearing in mind that we now have the statutory sick pay in place, and details of any pension or pension schemes, and the periods of notice to be given both by the employer or the employee, and also details of any collective agreement. So now additionally, you need to give additional information. So you need to give details of any training that's provided. In terms of a temporary agency worker, the identity of the end user. So if they're going to be working in a client premises, details of that. If the working pattern is completely or mostly unpredictable, an acknowledgement that the work schedule is variable, the number of guaranteed paid hours that they're going to receive, and the remuneration for same. And this obviously needs to be detailed for the employee so that they're clear on what are the predictable hours they're going to have. And the identity of the social insurance institution receiving the social insurance details. So PRSI and revenue obviously relevant in Ireland. So I'm going to move on from that. So you can see quite significant changes in terms of our statement and also our contract. And to complement that, we've a new Sick Leave Act in place since December 2022. And this sick leave now basically employees now are going to, from the 1st of January, have a sick pay entitlement of 3 days for 2023. And this is an entitlement for all employees once they have 13 weeks continuous service. It's paid to a maximum of €110 per day, or 70% of the employee's normal wage if it's more than €110. The employee must provide a valid medical cert for the first day of absence and for all the individual other 3 days. So if they're sick for 3 days together, one cert will suffice. If it's 3 individual days, a cert is required for each of the 3. Also, the employer must retain these records for 4 years, and there's only an exemption if the Labour Court agrees to same. And you can see here from the chart on your screen that at the moment it's anticipated that this will increase over time up to 2026. But for 2023, it's 3 initial days. So you need to outline this in your contract of employment, and you also need to consider updating any absence policy or any sick policy that you may have in place within the organisation. So next, I'm going to continue to update you in relation to the most relevant updates. And in the industry, one that has got huge media attention is the Payment of Wages, Tips and Gratuities Act. And this has made tips, gratuities and service charges outside of the scope of the person's contractual wages. So basically it can't be used to top up an employee's wages to make them compliant with the national minimum wage. And it's really important that in this case, it means that all employees are entitled to receive the cash and electronic tips that they may be given by customers in a fair manner. So there's 3 key requirements. One is that you need to have a policy in place to transparently outline how that is distributed in your business. There needs to be a notice in place for employees and customers that they can clearly see, and you'll see that this has started to be printed on menus, etc. And also there needs to be a written statement for the employee to explain the distribution of the policy, and this needs to be also done not alone in their contract but also in relation to when they get the tips. It needs to be clearly outlined in their pay slip that they are tips, or if another method is used, that there's a slip to go with it to explain how the tips have been distributed and for what period they apply. So I'm going to continue and move on to the next slide. And this is just to remind you of the Gender Pay Gap Act that's already in place in Ireland. And this requires all employers that have currently 250 staff or more to report on the gender pay gap that exists in their business. So they have to disclose the mean and median hourly wage gap for all employees, and data also linked to any bonuses. So at the minute, as I said, it's 250 staff for 2022. That's going to less than 150 staff or more in 2024, and 50 staff or over in 2025. And there's no expectation that that's going to be for less than 50 employees. So at the minute, if you have 250 or more staff, you should be doing this reporting, and there's links there on your screen that will be live links you can click on when you get the presentation, and you can go back into the Fáilte Ireland website to assist you in doing that. So that's an update for me in relation to all of the key pieces of legislation. I'm going to pass you back to Amanda, and thank you for your time and for listening.
Thanks, Caroline. God, there's a lot in that, and I think it's really clear to see now the transparency that is been brought to employment terms and conditions as a result of this legislation. But it's clear also that it has additional administrative demands on businesses. So great to have that clarity. And we'll come back to some questions from the audience as we move through. I'm now going to actually call on Dominica. Dominica, we've heard from Caroline regarding the summary of the legislation changes that need to be applied, but there's also been quite a raft of new national codes of practice applied since around 2020 and over 2021 and 2022. And I suppose we were very conscious in planning today that a lot of businesses were so engaged and distracted by, you know, re-onboarding and return to work for people after COVID that in actual fact, many businesses may not have had the time to actually really study the implications of these code of practices. So maybe you take us through now a little bit around how these practices need to be applied in the business, and maybe just to start even to help people to understand what's the difference between a code of practice and legislation in terms of our obligations.
Absolutely. Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to participate as a speaker in this webinar, and to give you a teaser, I suppose, in terms of what is covered in the videos that we prepared for you on codes of practice in relation to prevention of bullying and then harassment and sexual harassment. Firstly, I have to agree with Amanda in relation to a lot of employers being so caught up in the last couple of years that we in our practice notice that unfortunately a lot of companies are not up to date with the relevant codes of practice. So the purpose of today is to give you kind of a synopsis of what should be done, and then of course refer you to the videos. So Amanda asked me to clarify also the difference between the code of practice and the legislation itself. So codes of practice are basically sets of written rules which outline how employers should act in given situations. They are supplementary to the legislation, and they provide further guidance on good practice and good procedures as well. So with the enactment of Workplace Relations Act in 2015, the codes of practice are normally drafted by the Workplace Relations Commissions at this point in time. However, there are other bodies, for instance, Human Rights and Equality Commission, that can issue codes as well. And what is really important about the codes of practice is that they have no force in law, meaning that they're not legally binding. However, they're admissible as evidence during, for instance, the Workplace Relations Commission hearings. And therefore, you should bear in mind that failure to follow the code, the provisions of the code, can weaken an employer's defense in any such hearings. So that's why they're vitally important to be followed. So what I'm going to start with is the code of practice on prevention and resolution of bullying. So firstly, this code replaces the previous codes that were in place. There was 2 of them previously. And it really focuses on preventive measures when it comes to managing workplace to prevent bullying from either taking place or to mitigate its effects. And previously, there was a lot of focus on having the policy and making sure that people obviously have resolution options available to them should the complaint happen. However, now prevention is taken to the next level, I would call it. So what employers must do also is make sure that the policy is fit for purpose, that it's really well communicated to the employees, that there is really good leadership in place. For instance, managers are leading by example and they're addressing issues that may lead to allegations of bullying at some point, and that there is a real culture of involvement. So people actually know what the responsibilities under this policy are, and also a proper flow of communication. And in general, that there is intolerance of inappropriate behavior and that training is provided to all employees. And when we're talking about training, it relates to either training the employees on appropriate behavior, but it also relates to training relevant individuals that might be involved in handling of a complaint at some point. And that's to make sure that they are competent and comfortable in dealing with those complaints. The code has also introduced the role of a contact person, and this is a crucially important role, which the person like that would be normally appointed from team members. It doesn't necessarily have to be manager, and that person would be the first point of contact should somebody have a complaint. And they would be signposting the person. And if they're chosen correctly and if they are trained very well, they are potentially able to stop the formal complaint from actually taking place and repair the relationship by guiding the person on how potentially to address the complaint themselves to start with and give the person that they might be complaining of a chance. The code also puts emphasis on dealing with bullying complaints on the lowest level, and it also introduces the secondary informal stage. And we have actually covered this stage in a lot of detail in our video resource, and we talk you through the steps that are involved, and more importantly, what does resolving a complaint through this stage look like in practice? And we give you some useful questions to ask throughout facilitation of the meeting. The code also specified that there is no entitlement to formal investigation that is an automatic right. So informal investigation should only take place if informal resolution was unsuccessful. And if there is an employee that wishes to proceed to a formal investigation straight away, they have to go through what we call a preliminary screening. So this is submitting a written complaint with details of incidents that might constitute bullying, and then a manager is appointed and they assess whether those incidents, if proven, might fit the definition of bullying. And only when that preliminary screening is successful, the complaint proceeds to the formal stage. What is helpful about this code for employers is that it gives very clear definition in terms of what bullying is, and more importantly, what bullying isn't. So the behavior must first satisfy requirement of being repeated and inappropriate, and then it must be reasonably regarded as undermining the individual's right to dignity at work. Oftentimes when bullying allegations are raised, people obviously are extremely concerned, and rightly so, because they are very serious. However, the code helpfully outlines that, for instance, expressing differences of opinion strongly, or managing performance in a constructive manner, or taking a reasonable corrective action cannot be deemed to be bullying if it's conducted in a professional manner. So then in terms of the two codes, actually, they also modernize the way the complaints of bullying and harassment are handled in the workplace, and they make a reference to cyberbullying, so bullying that occurs online, whether through social media or in any other way like that. So I'm going to move on to the second code of practice, which is the code of practice on sexual harassment and harassment at work. And again, what is vitally important is that preventive measure and their importance is really very much emphasized in this code. And what differs this code from 2012 code is the fact that the code encourages employees, both that might be subject to harassment or that might witness harassment, to speak up and call out harassment to create the awareness, and obviously to highlight that it's completely inappropriate in the workplace. In addition to that, the code introduces a role of a senior level champion. And this would be a person that should not be a member of a HR team, but should be somebody with standing in the company that would be promoting initiatives around managing the workplace so that harassment and sexual harassment does not happen. The code also introduces the role of a competent person, which is very much like the contact person from the previous code. And in addition to that, their code calls out that should an investigation be taking place, there could be specific arrangements put in place to protect both parties. For instance, changing management structure, changing workstations, or requesting the complainant or the alleged perpetrator to stay at home on a fully paid leave. So it doesn't actually specifically mention suspension, which is important. In terms of the outcome, the previous code, which was the 2012 code, was calling onto the investigation of a complaint ending by an allegation being upheld or not. And that had implications on affording the natural justice to the person that was accused of that behavior. And this code specifically mentions that what needs to be the outcome of the investigation is the fact that it's established whether there is a case to answer and a recommendation made to proceed potentially to disciplinary hearing. In terms of appeal, the code is very specific, or more specific, I should say, in terms of the requirements. So it says that the appeal needs to happen in a specified time frame. And finally, the code also puts the onus on the employer to advise employees of their statutory rights in relation to the equality legislation, specifically the fact that statutory timelines for lodging a complaint under this act are not going to be paused because there is an investigation taking place in the workplace. So that concludes this specific section, and we're going to now move to Q&A.
Thank you very much, Dominica. There really is, I have to say, so much involved in those codes of practice, but I'm really delighted and I'm very confident that all of you will find a really simple, step-by-step, very comprehensive resource that really takes you through everything from interpreting the codes, applying the policy, undertaking the training, and the whole step-by-step around investigation. And I suppose, ways to avoid challenges around these areas of vicarious liability in terms of dignity and respect. So we will literally step you through those resource guides before we finish. But I suppose we've really covered a lot there in terms of the legislation changes and the code of practice. So we might just take a little bit of a discussion before we move over to audience questions, just around this whole area. And I might begin with you, Caroline. We've really covered a lot. So what would you say are the biggest risks of non-compliance from what we've covered today?
I suppose one of the biggest things is that vicarious liability that we've touched on, and ultimately what that means is that all employers have an obligation to do all they can to prevent. So for example, in relation to bullying and harassment and sexual harassment, you need to take steps like training, updating your policies, and making sure that there's a very strong awareness culture and an implementation culture. So that would be one. The second one, I suppose, is you've seen from the presentation the huge changes in the contract of employment, and both the initial statement and the follow-on full contract. So I suppose our advice, Amanda, has been to try and give one document from the very start rather than administratively having to manage both. But making sure that that's updated, and again the resources with this video set will assist in that regard. But I would say that's a really big priority. And the other key thing for me is the records and payslips. A lot of non-compliance from a WRC inspection perspective comes back to non-compliance. There was over 3,000 of the 12,000 complaints this year linked to pay, and a lot of those is making sure that the payslip is reflective of exactly what the person's been paid, how many hours, what are the premiums, what's the detail in relation to tips, etc. So ultimately, I think reviewing that and then just being very conscious of that organisational working time obligation to record working time breaks, etc. So they're probably the top ones, Amanda, but you could add to that list, no problem. But I think if you're those kind of key ones, you're going to be in the right side.
Yeah, and it's really helpful actually to kind of understand, the top areas where we can unknowingly, in some cases, fall foul of this. And I think there's really, it is definitely tightened around that record keeping and those pay slips, because there is a need now, for employer transparency around the payment and with regard to service and gratuities and that. And it was interesting, actually, I was looking back at some of the questions that came in advance of today's session, and there was a kind of a question, innocently that asked, well, actually, can I just let my staff manage their own tips and not get involved? But the reality of it is there's a lot of tips that come in, even if you were to, take that crazy notion that that's not compliant with, that transparency. And how do you ensure it's equal, and that, those that aren't dominating the conversation or holding the senior posts aren't making the decisions that are disadvantaging others, but equally then how you treat those tips and gratuities that come in on credit cards that are subject to tax that need distribution from the organisation. So I think it's fair to say, no, you can't let the employees self-determine on that. So just looking at those though, in terms of your experience of WRC and your role there in compliance, can you maybe tell us a little bit more about the biggest trends that you're seeing in the sector and the cases been brought to the WRC, and if there's any areas that our specific sector are at risk, Caroline?
So I suppose just to remind everybody, there's two specific areas in the WRC that are relevant. One is the inspection division, and the second is the adjudication and the labour court. So that's when an employee specifically takes a case in relation to a specific breach of the legislation that's alleged. So in relation to the inspections, we had 4,432 inspections in 2021. Of those, 61% were unannounced, which really, I suppose, flags the importance of using the information in today's webinar, but also in the videos and in the resources to be compliant, and do maybe a mock WRC inspection yourself to make sure that you are compliant. And the videos and the guides we've prepared really will absolutely guide you through that in a very, you know, easy, practical way. I suppose in relation to the complaints specifically, Amanda, there was 12,000 cases taken to the WRC. Of those, 3,000 were linked to pay and 1,500 were linked to equality. So again, you've seen some very high profile cases linked to equality in the hospitality industry where breaches have occurred. So I think there are probably two key watchouts. We've spoken about the pay and we've spoken about the equality. And I suppose just to flag, in terms of the inspections, they will do a detailed audit of all of your paperwork and make sure that it is reflective of what is the basics in terms of that legal compliance. So just to give you that kind of breakdown, I suppose, just gives people a bit of insight in relation to the importance of being prepared.
Really, really helpful there, Caroline. And I suppose that also speaks to that transparency that we're trying to get to in the need to record and report gender pay gaps now. So I suppose, you know, at a sector and a government-wide level, there is definite proactive measures been taken to look at that whole gender pay gap as one area around equality, obviously. So just, Dominica, we might come to you now. Caroline has given us, you know, really helpful synopsis of where we can go wrong when employers don't fail to meet their obligations. But maybe you could share with participants how you feel the compliance areas can really have a positive impact on their business.
Absolutely, I'd be delighted to. Usually compliance isn't something that people get excited about, but hopefully with my pitch here, they will understand how it can positively impact their business and the industry as a whole. So there's a lot of work that is being done at the moment. People have certainly realized that retention, you know, is extremely important, and that in general, we need to keep our employees happy. And compliance really, you know, comes into that in many ways. So let me explain this. It is my belief that compliance is a foundation of any successful organization. If your compliance isn't in place, it's like you're trying to, you know, if you're trying to look after your culture and do all those, you know, exciting initiatives, but your compliance isn't in place, the whole foundation is going to basically collapse. So culturally, I suppose, when you're trying to say to your employees, oh, I care about you, you know, you're important, we genuinely, you know, believe that our employees are our biggest asset, that is not a statement that, you know, employees are going to perceive as a genuine statement if you do not respect their rights that are enshrined in the legislation, if you do not, you know, treat their requests for leave consistently, if you do not grant their leave, for instance, maternity leave in line with the provisions of the legislation. So compliance in this way really is the action behind the words that you're saying to your employees in telling them that you genuinely do care. And what compliance also does is it establishes trust. The employees know that they are going to be, you know, managed fairly, that they know, you know, that these are the rules of engagement, and the expectations are really clear from the outset as well. Then in terms of policies and procedure, they are really important for any organization to set boundaries and to also let employees know really what the rules are, and to manage their expectation as well. And, you know, when we're saying about compliance and how helpful having policies and procedures in the context of, for instance, managing bullying and harassment in the workplace, you know, that too, I guess, you know, those standards of behaviors that you're setting up for yourself and how you manage people, for instance, through constructive performance management, is going to also result in you having, you know, in employees and not accusing you of bullying, because they know that this is the standard, that constructive performance management is something that the company does on a regular basis. Just to kind of summarize some more benefits of compliance, you know, it will lead to improved employee morale, because if people feel like they are being cared for, they will be more energized to work in the organization. They're going to be more connected with the organization. The same goes to employee well-being, then managing turnover and reducing retention, you know, helping with equality, diversity and inclusion in the workplace, improving safety as well, productivity, and most importantly, all of this is going to lead to you, you know, having a reputation either internally or externally as a great employer, and strengthening your employer brand, which is so incredibly vital in today's world where, you know, people research you before they come to work for you. So I would say that's why, you know, compliance is really important, and that looking at it from this perspective is actually going to motivate you to give it some great attention.
Great, yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And I suppose, interestingly, I was at a Great Places to Work summit actually last week. And it was interesting when that point you're making about, you know, that the employee trusts you, and it develops that positive culture. One of the things that Great Places to Work were saying is prospective employees, so in other words, that talent that you're trying to secure, are 3 times more likely to come to you if they experience positive sentiments from the people who work with you. So in actual fact, how you show up yourself and how you think you're showing up, it's irrelevant. It's down to the litmus test of what employees say about you and their role as advocates for your business. So we might just actually just very quickly, Dominica, any top tips in terms of making sure day-to-day compliance we're on top of?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So firstly, watch all the resources and use the accompanying resources in this video series, because, you know, there has been a lot of care and attention that went into them. I would say invest some time. At the beginning, you have to look at what you have in place in terms of, like Caroline mentioned, do a mock audit, and, you know, review your contracts, your policies, procedures, and the systems, which is how you actually manage compliance in the workplace. And then think of implementing some system. And it doesn't necessarily need to be HR software. You can be using a simple Excel spreadsheet to manage, for instance, you know, fixed term contracts, setting yourself calendar reminders to manage probation, or for instance, expiry of the training, implementing checklists, for instance, all the different tasks that you have to do to be compliant when taking people on board and when offboarding them. Create templates for yourself. Think about what it is that you're doing in terms of training and what it is that you need to provide going forward. Very importantly, train your managers so that they have the knowledge they need and that they are able to manage fairly. And finally, attend any future Fáilte Ireland webinars on HR-related topics.
Thanks, Dominica, that's great. So look, we're going to actually move across towards audience questions now, but before I do, Colette, we might actually just take an audience poll question really around the subject of retention, just for people to get a sense of where the industry is at and where you stand in comparison with everybody else. So we know 2020 and 2021 saw significant attrition of staff from the industry. So excluding this period of trading uncertainty, maybe we'd ask the audience now to rate your staff retention over the last year. Has it improved a lot, improved slightly, more challenging? Maybe you've seen no change, or maybe you actually want to admit, I actually don't know, I haven't had time to look at this or measure it. So if you could submit your views in the poll, and we will move on to some audience questions. And I know Orna has been sending me some of those. So we will actually get started straight away on those. The first one that I would like to look at, and just before we look at that, Colette, are we able to actually give the results of the poll as yet? Okay, so some are finding it more challenging, I suppose 37%. Some are seeing no change, and then some are actually positively recording it's improving between a lot and somewhat. So really positive there, up at about 50% to see improvements. If we're not seeing changes, or you don't know, one thing I would say to those that don't know, it really is a really good measure to set a baseline in terms of understanding what your attrition rates are, because there is real costs associated with high attrition rates. And I suppose in a recent analysis we were doing ourselves based on our workforce surveys, you know, our industry probably sits somewhere between 30 and 35% attrition rate, while in actual fact, you know, the workforce in Ireland as a whole sits at an average of about 15%. So it's really clear we have a bit to go on that. So in the old adage, it says, you know, what gets measured gets managed. So I would suggest to you to kind of start to look at ways of measuring that over time, so you can see, you know, what is helping improve those improvements, or what still remains as a barrier around that. So just looking at some audience questions now for the panelists. I will just pull those out, just look at some live questions. So just the first one that comes to mind to hear is from Orla Murphy. Caroline, I'll send this one to you. When you talk about the contracts and the option of having a kind of portfolio of work, does that mean businesses now need to remove the exclusivity service clause and double employment clause in our contracts?
So we don't need to remove it if you can give objectively justified grounds, and there's outlined in the legislation there are what's called incompatibility reasons, and it needs to match that. So obviously, for example, one I gave an example of, Amanda, is if it's in direct conflict with, for example, intellectual property, or, you know, the person might be, if they do that job and our job, they might go over the maximum 48-hour working week that's in place. So there is reasons that you can still have it there, but you need to make it specific to that person. So it's obviously also got to be proportionate. So if you have somebody and they're working with you part-time, then they should be allowed work somewhere else to make up their full hours that they need to earn a living. So that's the idea behind it, that it can't just be a blanket clause. And the legislation, I would say, is actually very reasonable in terms of what's outlined in those specific rationale reasons as to why you might be able to restrict. So I would say update rather than remove, and just make it reflective of the specific role.
Okay, and I suppose, Caroline, just linked to that then, how is a business to manage the 48-hour working week if the employee is working in another company? Is that where you need to kind of agree an arrangement with the other business as well, that you'll both operate a 48-hour contract, so there's, you know, transparency around that? So you might
ultimately, the requirement would be for the employee to let us know if they're obviously working somewhere else, so we can assess if it meets any of the exclusivity provisions that might cause us a concern. And then if they do, we let them know that it's up to them to manage, that their hours shouldn't exceed in total the 48 hours, because from an administrative perspective, we can't get involved in trying to manage somebody else's work somewhere else. So that's their responsibility once we've clearly outlined what we have in place in our organisation.
Okay, so again, it points to just that clarity and that communication paper trail that actually confirms that the responsibility sits with them in regard to that. There's been a number of questions both in the pre-submission questions, and I just see another one here now that's come in live, just around this whole area of the minimum wage of $11.30 and looking at this in the context of Sunday premium. Somebody has asked here, is a minimum wage of $11.35 per hour instead of $11.30 sufficient to cover Sunday premium? You might speak a little bit to that Sunday premium idea, Caroline, if you wouldn't mind. And also another one that came in that's kind of somewhat related is this whole area of unsocial hours and payment for unsocial hours. Would you maybe just give some guidance on that?
Yeah, so the legislation basically requires that a premium is paid for Sunday, and it doesn't say what that premium is, but it needs to be decided in terms of what's fair and reasonable. But it's required to show in your payslip where the person has been actually paid for that premium. And there's been lots of case law where both the WRC and the Labour Court have said that the premium that has been proposed is not reflective. So if you make the payment 11.35, using that as the example of the specific question that you flagged, ultimately, if everybody's paid 11.35, whether they work Sunday or whether they don't, obviously then that's not a premium. So that's not meeting your legislative requirement. So again, when I was covering the pay slip being one of the most important things, it needs to clearly outline what are the hours that are worked at standard time, what are the hours that are worked at premium, and how is the person compensated. Obviously, for some of our employees, like a trainee manager or a duty manager, maybe a bar manager, you know, etc., they may be on a salary, and that incorporates payment for their Sunday. But again, that clearly is well above minimum wage, and again, it clearly outlines you do normally 2 Sundays, or, you know, whatever the case may be. So again, it differentiates and makes it clear to the person, first of all, what are they signing up to, and an inspector, if they were to check it, the clarity also for them in relation to what was actually agreed.
Okay, and I suppose we can take it for granted that the treatment of that premium and what a premium is paid for in terms of Sunday work on social hours should be transparent and I suppose equitable for all staff. I think is that fair to say?
Absolutely, Amanda, and the Labour Court has given some suggestions as to what they see as that reasonable payment. However, I think each business needs to assess that based on their location, based on the role, based on the work, etc. So I think rather than giving kind of an overarching piece of advice as to what people should pay, I think they need to kind of assess that themselves, but clearly then reflect it in their contracts, their documents, etc.
Great, great. Another question here then, before I go to Dominica from Enda Murray, and I think we've answered that. If you provide the full contract within the first 5 days, you don't need the provision of the separate 5-day statement. I think that's fair to say, and that's the point you were making. Ease the administrative burden on yourself by getting the full contract out, terms and conditions as required in the first 5 days, and then you don't have 2 admin steps to do. Okay.
Agreed, because it is a lot of responsibility, particularly if you're taking on seasonal staff, etc., you know, and more milestones and more compliance, more sign-offs to make sure. And as we all know, one will always slip through the cracks, so we need to make sure that we're avoiding against that. And this, I think, is a good, you know, way of doing one that's covering both.
Great. So Dominica, just coming over to you then, just in terms of that calculation for sick pay for hourly paid employees, if they're rostered a day off within the leave time, should they be paid? So in other words, you know, somebody's rostered to be off tomorrow, Wednesday, they fall sick today, so should the cover include for both days? And I think that what we understand, I think, by the legislation is that even if you're on annual leave, your annual leave pauses if you have certified sick leave and a certificate submitted. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, that is the case for, I guess, a situation whereby there is annual leave. However, if it's an ordinary day off, I would actually go back to the regulations. So the regulations in terms of how the daily rate of sick pay is calculated actually came out on the 2nd of December 2022. And when it comes to the employees whose rate is variable, the regulation says that the gross amount payable in respect of statutory leave shall be lesser of 110 or 70% of the sum that would have been payable to the employee had he or she worked on the statutory leave day. So obviously, if they're not scheduled to work on a statutory leave day, there's no payment due to them in that regard. So that's how the statutory leave payment would be calculated for variable employees.
Okay, and then just related to, I think, what Caroline was asking earlier, then another one that came in regarding staff that are rostered 3 days a week. If one of those is a Sunday, are we obliged to pay extra for Sunday work? And does this differ for part-time and full-time staff?
So absolutely, the answer to the question is yes, you are obliged to pay employees who work on Sunday as you would with anybody else, as per what Caroline outlined already in terms of the premium and the requirements of the same. In relation to making any differentiation between part-time employees and full-time employees, what you should be aware of is that there is legislation that protects part-time employees from being treated any less favorably than full-time employees. And that relates to, for instance, matters like Sunday premium as well.
Great. And Dominica, then one other question. You spoke about this important new role, really, of the contact person, and even in terms of, you know, training staff in terms of a preliminary investigation. Obviously, you know, that is a specialist training area. I think it's fair to say, you know, some people have been asking, you know, where would you access some of that kind of training? And I think, you know, am I fair to say that, you know, HR consultants like yourself and Caroline, you know, do that training, but equally you were saying possibly SkillNet are doing this training in some areas?
Absolutely. So a consultancy is a great choice because, you know, this is something that we deal with day in, day out. However, in terms of getting some, I guess, cost-effective solution as well, you can contact the SkillNet that you're a member of, and they surely will be able to arrange this type of training for you, whether it's for contact person, for people that are investigators, or for instance, for the nominated people, or, you know, for all employees in the organization as well.
Great, great. And just coming back then to some other questions. Caroline, are we required under the new legislation to update contracts for existing staff, and how do you suggest going about doing that?
Would suggest is that you use your handbook as your opportunity to update employees in relation to the new policy changes that have come about. So, for example, in relation to the introduction of pay, in relation to the enhanced elements of dignity and respect, etc., it's best to do that as part of your handbook. For a lot of employees, if you go back and retrospectively ask them to re-sign a new contract, they can be very suspicious of the why. So ultimately what's been changed here is for, particularly in the contract and statement, are for new employees. So I think your annual update of your handbook, which all organisations do, because as you rightly said at the outset, has been so much legislative and policy changes that updating your handbook is the best way of reflecting all the changes we've mentioned for current staff today.
Great, great. And finally then, just a question in regard to, probation. So if people have a question about probation period, is it just on contracts after the 22nd of August 2022? For example, there's a contract at the moment from June 2022 that has a 12-month probation attached to it. So can you clarify that, Caroline?
Yeah, so the legislation came in on the 16th of December, just to remind everybody, not August. And the second clarification in that, in relation to probation, the new legislation on the 16th of December, for any current contracts that have more than 6 months, it is whichever is less, up to the 1st of February 2023 or the 6 months. So that time has now lapsed. So for everybody, any period of time, their probation is passed at this stage.
Okay, great. Okay, look, I think that really concludes the majority of the questions that we have. There's a few others which really, I suppose, are the ones that speak very much to the work we have put into the video resources that we have. So without further ado, I actually would like to thank Caroline for taking the questions there. We will come back very briefly at the end. And for the audience questions and what you've submitted. But here now to tell us a little bit more about these resources is my colleague Orna, who has been head, neck and shoulders, I think it's fair to say, in the development of these resources with our experts, Caroline and Dominica. So Orna, over to you maybe to step everybody through where we go from here.
Thank you.
To navigate people.
Perfect, Amanda, I presume you can hear me. Okay, thanks so much. So Caroline and Dominica both spoke about the various videos that are supporting, or I suppose leading this webinar. So the Meeting Your Employer Obligations video suite is housed on Fáilte Ireland's Business Support Hub. So we'll share a direct link to the page with you shortly, but for now I want to give you a short walkthrough of how to access these videos, their layout and the supporting resources which are accompanying each video. So to navigate to it, you can see the support hub is on screen now, and if you go to Business Supports and navigate to the HR section on the top there on the left, and as you scroll down the page here, you will see Meeting Your Employer Obligations is there. So when you click into that, you'll see that there are 10 videos in total as you scroll down the page there. And these cover a range of relevant topics which you've heard referred to throughout the session today. Now, there's a full list of the topics is clearly visible there on the Business Support Hub page. It's worth noting that all of these videos and resources are relevant to all employers, and the vertical layout of the topics on this page does not reflect a particular order or particular sequence that they should be watched in. So that means that you can and you should dip in and out of these videos and their accompanying resources that are most relevant to you at any particular time as needs arise in your business, or indeed you can watch them just in general to ensure that you are complying with the relevant legislation in your general practice, as Dominica and Caroline have referred to today. So in terms of engaging with the individual topics, they're visible and they're easy to find by clicking on the relevant section on this page. So if I click here on payment of wages, you can see that this opens to a particular part on the page, and you can see the video as well as the resources here. So for this particular topic, there's 5 supporting resources, and they're all available to download and can be used to help you to comply with the legislation with the tips given in the video. Now, I won't click on the video just for a moment. I'll click on go to video page in 1 second, but before I do that, I'll just talk you through the outline of the videos. So just to give you an idea, each video has a similar layout. So each starts with an introduction to the topic and then moves on to specify the legislation that is relevant to that particular topic. And you can also find links to specific legislation for the topic in the videos for each, in the resources for each video. So regarding the rest of the layout of the video, each one refers specifically to policies that you must have in place as an employer, and then also to policies that are not obligatory, but which Caroline and Dominica would strongly recommend that you have in place. For example, policy relating to a non-protective leave. Following on from that then, the videos also specify any particular procedures that should be formalised and communicated to staff. For example, formal and informal procedures relating to bullying or harassment. And indeed then, going back to what Caroline said there a moment ago, how they should be communicated to staff, for example, in your staff handbook. You may also be glad to hear that there's a mention in each video of the employee responsibilities in relation to each topic in each video as well. So towards the end of each video, Caroline and Dominica also specify the risks of non-compliance with your employer obligations in relation to the topic. So as you heard earlier, these range from, for example, negative workplace culture, a negative employer brand, or at the very serious end of the scale, as Caroline spoke about, workplace relations commissions, investigations, or cases being brought. So to counteract those risks, each video is summed up with top tips for complying with the legislation or the code of practice, and also that will help you to avoid any negative consequences. So if we click into go to video page, this is in relation to payment of wages. This will just open up the video in a slightly bigger tab or a little bit more visible. And when I click play to video here, you'll see that the progress bar along the bottom of the video is divided up, and these divisions here reflect the various topics within the video. So I can just see that this starts, as I said, with an introduction to the topic, then it moves on to the legislation pertaining to payment of wages, and then on to national minimum wage. So you can see there, if you scroll your mouse along the progress bar, you can see the names of these particular chapters, which will make it a little bit easier to navigate these somewhat long videos as you watch them. That said, each video is quite long, but that means it is very comprehensive on its topic. So it really is our recommendation that you'd watch the video in full the first time you watch it, and then you'll have a really good understanding of what's involved, and I suppose what particular chapter within that video is more relevant to best support your needs at that particular time. So a slightly easier way to navigate these specific chapters, however, is if you watch on YouTube. So you can see that there's a YouTube icon on the bottom right hand corner here, and if I click this here, this will open the exact same video on YouTube itself. So within the description on YouTube, which is just below the video in this grey box, you can see that the videos are, the chapters within each video are clearly listed there. So it's slightly easier to navigate to the correct place. You can click directly on the listing there, and the video will automatically skip to the correct place there, for example, regarding the national minimum wage or Sunday premium, which I know there are some questions about. However, if you do access the video this way, what's not available on YouTube is the supporting resources, which are really key to helping you to implement the requirements in relating to these topics. So I want to go back to the Business Supports Hub page now and just show you some of those resources. So I'll go back to the Business Supports Hub page, and I'll actually go to the employment contracts and terms and conditions, which is the first topic there. And we can see that there's various resources there. So if we look at this, we can see that one of the topics related here is the related links. So when I download this file and just click to download it, this is a similar resource that's available for all the specific topics, and it links directly to the specific legislation which is related to this topic. In this case, it's regarding employment contracts and their terms and conditions. And I know there are quite a few questions on that. So the legislation itself is linked there, as it is in a similar document in relation to all of the 10 videos that we have on the Support Hub page. Another example in this particular topic, which is employment contracts and their terms and conditions, is a guidance document on public holidays, particularly relevant now, actually, as it happens. So this guidance document, it is, my apologies, it's in payment of wages. So that guidance document, it gives details on the entitlements of employees in relation to public holidays, such as their pay or their leave entitlements, and walks through various possibilities. So for example, if an employee is required to work on a public holiday, or on the other hand, what the entitlement is if the business is closed on a public holiday, for example. I think this is a really good example to show you, as it gives a really clear idea of how detailed these resources are to help you to implement the requirements here. So while I'm only showing you 2 examples here and just a very brief overview of what's on that Business Supports Hub page, I want to stress that each video has specific and related supporting resources that you can use to implement the advice given here. We really strongly recommend that you download and use these resources as you watch each video, as they'll really support you as you comply with these obligations, to create the evidence of compliance, as we heard the importance of that earlier, and ultimately to create and indeed maintain a positive employer brand even. So we'll share the links to that page with you, and Amanda, I'm happy to hand back over to you now just before we finish up.
Thanks, Sorna. I have to say, this is probably the most comprehensive reference resource material to employer compliance that I have seen developed, and I'd really like to personally thank Orna, who project managed the curation of this expert content with Dominica and Caroline to craft the material for you. I have to say, personally, had I had access to something like this as a young HR manager in the industry many moons ago, I really would have found it an awful lot easier. And I have to say, as Orna mentioned, this speaks also to employee obligations. So I know when I was looking through the material and we were kind of designing the approach to this, well, I really feel that there is a role for this material, reference material, not only for you to dip in and out of as you see fit, but also to guide you in terms of, development and updates to your handbook, your staff policies and structure around that, but equally in terms of staff training, because it does cover very clearly the call outs for employees as well as employers. So do have a look at it and think about it in the context of staff induction programs and ongoing staff and management development and getting them to actually look at those materials as well as part of their development. Obviously, all of that been required to be delivered within, all training to be required to be delivered within the working time, as is now confirmed within the legislation. So I suppose before we finish up, I'd like to go back to Caroline just for a moment to give us a sense as well of upcoming legislation. We know that legislative changes continue to evolve, and I suppose, Caroline, we did want to kind of finish with just signposting to some of what we can expect later this year and early into the future. So maybe you'd step us through that. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. And as you rightly said, it's ever changing. So this is just to give you a heads up to signpost you in relation to legislation that we expect to be coming in 2023. One piece is the Work-Life Balance and Miscellaneous Provisions Bill, and that's very relevant to all businesses. So I'm going to take you through some key elements of that in a moment. Also, the Living Wage Bill is before Dáil Éireann at the moment, so we'll wait and see what's happening in relation to that. And as you see, the government in 2022 announced the intent to move from the minimum wage to the living wage, and that transition is currently happening. Also, the auto enrolment of pension, we expect in late 2023, very significant implication in relation to pension, where employees will be auto enrolled, and there's proposed details of how much the employer and employee contribution will be, and there'll also be a government contribution, and that'll be linked to employee service, but they'll be automatically enrolled into the scheme, have windows of opt-out, but if they opt out, they'll automatically be auto-enrolled again after 2 years. So again, that's a definite one to watch. And also there's a Supreme Court hearing of the Revenue Commissioners linked to a Domino's pizza delivery driver case, which will have implications for the assessment of contractors and employees, which is one that has come up time and time again, and it's one that continues to come up. So I think that's going to be one, again, that's going to be very relevant. I suppose I'm going to specifically give you a little bit more detail of the one that is most imminent, which is the upcoming Miscellaneous Provisions Bill linked to work-life balance. And the government fast-tracked the right to request remote working to implement it into this bill, and the proposed legislation now has the right to request remote working for any employee, and ultimately the employer needs to objectively justify why they potentially may say no. So that's one to watch. There was in the earlier drafts a number of reasons they've been removed. Also, this bill is going to introduce specific leave for those caring for members of their family. It's also going to introduce flexible working, specifically for those that have caring responsibilities. And it's also going to introduce specific leave linked to domestic violence. So that's still at draft stage, but it's quite progressed at this stage. The WRC are going to be producing a code of practice to go with it when it eventually becomes legislation. So again, we'll keep you updated in relation to that, but a very significant one that will have impact on all employees, and again, update in terms of policies and in terms of being aware of leave obligations. So that, I think, Amanda, is the main update in relation to that, and I'm delighted to pass back over to you again.
Thank you so much there, Caroline. So look, that's really great to know, to at least know what to expect that's coming down the line. As you say, it's an ever-evolving situation. Before I step everybody through just our additional resources, again, just a reminder to you actually around these additional resources, the link to them there is on the slide, and we will make these links live for you when we deliver the PowerPoint, but Orna has stepped you through how to navigate that. But also a reminder about our upcoming support program schedule. This is a full suite of all the training interventions and supports for businesses that we have throughout the year, and that's continually updated all the time. So please do dip into that. So whether you want to support staff with upskilling in terms of sales, marketing, digital, managing climate action, it's all there on the support suite. Very easy for you and your staff team to register and get involved. And as I say, we continually update that calendar all the time, so please do check back regularly on that. So if I could possibly, Colette, just before I finish up, go to a final poll for the audience, please, just in terms of how useful you feel the webinar content and materials will be in terms of helping you implement the learning and in meeting your employer obligations. And just as you complete that poll, I would like to say a final thank you to all our participants and our experts today, to Dominique and Caroline for being so practical in your advice and guidance. Thanks to Orna for stepping through the resources, and to both Orna, Dominique and Caroline for working with me in putting together the comprehensive suite of resources that really is there as your HR Bible and toolkit going forward around compliance and meeting your obligations. Thank you at the back end to Colette for keeping us on track with the technology today, and to Fiona and the team in First Western for the background and the work you've done with us on this. And finally, a huge thanks to you, our audience, for sticking with us and taking the time to be with us today. We hope you've addressed the majority of your questions. As I say, some other questions that you did pose, the answers to those are in the resources, so please do get digging and dip in and out to those as you see fit. So without further ado, I will call it a day and just say thank you very much to everybody. Have a great day, and we'll see you soon.